The blood-soaked telegram trembled in Grace Daugherty's hands as she stood on her porch, staring at the endless prairie stretching beyond her homestead. "Regret to inform you. Husband killed. Outlaw ambush." The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. 3 years of marriage to John ended with 13 cruel words on a scrap of yellow paper. The year was 1876, and at 25, Grace was now a widow in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming. Their small ranch outside Silver Creek sat quiet in the late afternoon sun, the cattle lowing in the distance, unaware that their master would never return. She crumpled the telegram in her fist. The memories were everywhere: John's hat still hanging by the door, his shaving mug beside the basin, his boots waiting by the hearth. Their dreams of building something together shattered in an instant. "I cannot bear this," she whispered to the empty house. Not just the loss, but the memories that now haunted every corner of the home they'd built together. Every reminder stabbed like a fresh wound. Grace had 1 week to decide her future. With no children and limited funds, her options were few in a land where a woman alone faced countless dangers. Her sister in Boston had already written, urging her to return east. Yet the thought of abandoning everything John had worked for seemed a second betrayal. As twilight descended across the Wyoming horizon, Grace made her decision. She would sell the ranch and head west to California, where no memories of John existed. Perhaps there she could start anew. The next morning she rode into Silver Creek, her black mourning dress stark against the golden prairie. The town had grown steadily over the past few years, with a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, and various other businesses serving the growing settlement. She tied her horse outside Mr. Patterson's bank, straightened her shoulders, and stepped inside. "Mrs. Daugherty," Patterson said, removing his spectacles. The small man's eyes conveyed both sympathy and calculation. "My sincere condolences. Such a tragedy." "Thank you," Grace replied formally. "I've come to discuss selling the ranch." Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Selling? So soon? Perhaps you might consider waiting. My decision is made," Grace interrupted. "I plan to leave for California within the month." The banker cleared his throat. "Mrs. Daugherty, with all respect, property values are currently depressed. The drought has made ranching difficult, and with the railroad still miles away, I fear you wouldn't get fair value." Grace frowned. "What would you suggest? Wait until spring. Manage the ranch through winter when the value will likely increase. I could assist with hiring hands." His eyes shifted. "Or perhaps consider remarriage. Several respectable men in town would know." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I have no interest in remarrying, Mr. Patterson. But I will consider your advice about waiting until spring." As Grace exited the bank, her mind racing with this unwelcome complication, she collided with a solid form. "Pardon me, madam," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her shoulders. Grace looked up to find herself face to face with a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. His clothes were trail-worn, and a well-used Stetson sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "My fault entirely," she murmured, stepping back. "I wasn't watching where I was going." The stranger studied her morning attire, understanding flickering across his features. "No harm done," he replied softly, tipping his hat before continuing past her into the bank. Grace stood momentarily frozen, struck by the brief encounter. Something about the stranger had momentarily pierced through her grief, perhaps his quiet courtesy or the fact that he was unfamiliar, someone who knew nothing of her loss. She shook herself from her reverie and continued down the boardwalk toward the general store. She needed supplies if she was to remain through winter. Inside, Mrs. Henderson greeted her with excessive sympathy. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Daugherty, such terrible news about John. How are you managing all alone out there?" Grace forced a polite smile. "I'm managing fine, thank you. I need flour, coffee, and sugar, please." As Mrs. Henderson gathered the items, she continued, "Sheriff Wilkins was just in this morning. Said they've caught one of the outlaws responsible. Hanging's set for next week." Grace's hands trembled as she placed coins on the counter. The idea that one of John's killers would face justice should have brought some comfort, but it only made her loss more palpable. "Will you attend?" Mrs. Henderson asked, wrapping the packages. "I don't believe so," Grace answered. Watching a man die, even one who had taken John from her, wouldn't ease her pain. As Grace loaded her supplies into her saddlebags, she noticed the stranger from earlier exiting the bank, deep in conversation with Mr. Patterson. Both men glanced her way, causing Grace to frown. Were they discussing her? The thought irritated her as she mounted her horse and headed back toward the ranch. The solitary ride gave her too much time with her thoughts. John had been taken while driving cattle to market, an ordinary task, turned deadly when outlaws ambushed the drive. His foreman, Clive Hutchins, had survived to tell the tale and bring John's body home for burial beside the cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. As Grace approached the ranch, she saw an unfamiliar horse tethered at the hitching post. Alarm shot through her until she recognized Clive sitting on the porch steps. "Mrs. Daugherty," he said, standing as she dismounted. The middle-aged man removed his hat, revealing hair gone mostly gray. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just came to check how you're faring." "I'm managing," she replied, the phrase becoming her standard response. "Would you care for coffee?" Inside, as the coffee boiled on the stove, Clive shifted uncomfortably. "Madam, I've come about the ranch. The men are wondering about their positions with winter coming and all." Grace poured the coffee and sat across from him. "Mr. Patterson has advised me to wait until spring to sell. I'll need help maintaining things until then." Relief crossed Clive's weathered face. "That's good news, madam. The boys were worried they'd be out of work before Christmas." "You're all welcome to stay on. I'll need you to manage everything as John would have." Her voice caught on her husband's name. Clive studied his coffee cup. "There's another matter, madam. That stranger in town, the one I saw you speaking with." Grace frowned. "I bumped into someone outside the bank. I didn't catch his name." "That'd be Lucas Tanner. He's been asking questions about available land. Word is he's looking to settle in these parts." Clive hesitated. "He was at the bank when I went to deposit the cattle money." "Overheard him talking about your property specifically." Grace set her cup down harder than intended. "My property isn't for sale yet, and when it is, I'll decide who to sell to. Just thought you should know, madam, men like that drifters with sudden money, they bear watching." After Clive departed, Grace found herself distracted by thoughts of the stranger Lucas Tanner. Why would he be inquiring about her ranch specifically? The idea that people were already circling, waiting for the widow to falter, kindled her anger. She would not be pushed or manipulated, regardless of her circumstances. The following day, Grace awoke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. Grabbing John's rifle from beside the bed, she moved cautiously to the window. Through the morning mist, she recognized Sheriff Wilkins riding up with another man, the stranger from town. Grace hurriedly dressed and pinned her hair, irritation growing. What business did Lucas Tanner have at her ranch? She opened the door as they dismounted. "Morning, Mrs. Daugherty," the sheriff called, removing his hat. "Hope we're not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, Sheriff," she replied coolly. "What brings you out this way?" "Got someone I'd like you to meet." He gestured to his companion. "This here's Lucas Tanner. Just arrived from Montana Territory. Mr. Tanner, Mrs. Grace Daugherty. The tall man removed his hat, revealing those same piercing blue eyes that had briefly caught her attention in town. Up close, she noted the faint scar that ran along his jawline and the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, markers of a life lived outdoors. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength she'd noticed before. "Sorry to intrude on your morning." Grace kept her expression neutral. "What exactly is your business here, Mr. Tanner?" the sheriff answered before Lucas could. "Mr. Tanner's got experience tracking outlaws. He's offered to help hunt down the rest of the gang that killed John." Grace's breath caught. "I was told you'd already captured one of them." "Just one," the sheriff confirmed. "There were 5 in total. The one we caught, man named Reeves, he's refusing to name his accomplices." Lucas spoke up. "I tracked men like these in Montana. Same pattern of attacks on cattle drives. I believe they're heading south toward Colorado Territory." Grace studied him skeptically. "And why would you involve yourself in this matter, Mr. Tanner? Did you know my husband?" "No, madam. I didn't have that honor." His gaze was steady. "But I've seen what men like these do to communities. No one's safe until they're brought to justice." Something in his tone suggested personal experience, a depth of understanding that went beyond professional interest. "Sheriff asked me to stop by," Lucas continued. "Thought you might have details about what your husband was carrying that day, anything that might help track them." Grace's defenses rose. "My foreman, Mr. Hutchins, was there. He's already told the sheriff everything." "Sometimes details get overlooked," Lucas said gently. "Something that seemed unimportant might help connect these men to other robberies." Grace hesitated, torn between wanting justice for John and her distrust of this stranger who had been asking about her land. "Perhaps you gentlemen would like coffee while we discuss this," she finally offered, deciding she wanted to learn more about Lucas Tanner's motives. Inside, Grace busied herself with the coffee pot while the men settled at the kitchen table. The domesticity of the scene men at her table, coffee brewing, brought a painful reminder of mornings with John. "Mr. Hutchins mentioned they took the money from the cattle sale," she said, placing cups before them. "And John's pocket watch, a family heirloom from his father." Lucas nodded. "Can you describe the watch?" Silver, with an engraving of a stag on the cover. Inside, it's inscribed with time, reveals truth in Latin. "Distinctive," Lucas commented. "That might turn up if they try to sell it." "There was something else," Grace said slowly, remembering. "John had a letter from the railroad company. They were surveying for a new line and had interest in our northern pasture." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "John never mentioned that to me. It wasn't finalized. The letter came just days before he left for the cattle drive." Grace's eyes narrowed as she looked at Lucas. "Is that why you've been asking about our land, Mr. Tanner?" Lucas met her gaze directly. "I heard rumors in town about the railroad. Thought it might explain why those particular outlaws targeted your husband's drive." "If they knew about potential railroad money coming in." "So you're not interested in purchasing my ranch?" Grace pressed. A faint smile touched his lips. "Madam, I couldn't afford a spread like this if I worked another 20 years. I'm just trying to connect the pieces." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Tanner's agreed to delay his own plans to help track these outlaws. The town's taken up a collection to fund the hunt." Grace studied Lucas, trying to reconcile this information with Clive's warnings. "And what are these plans of yours that you're delaying, Mr. Tanner?" "I was heading to California," he replied. "Thought I might try my hand at something other than ranch work for a change." The coincidence of their shared destination wasn't lost on Grace. "California is a long way from here." "That it is," he agreed. "But I've heard it's a good place for new beginnings." After the men departed, Grace found herself watching Lucas Tanner as he mounted his horse, noting his easy confidence in the saddle, the way he seemed aware of his surroundings without being obvious about it. He didn't carry himself like a typical cowhand. There was something more deliberate in his movements, something that spoke of a man accustomed to danger. The following days passed in a blur of ranch work and preparations for winter. Grace found herself working alongside the ranch hands, learning tasks that John had always handled. The physical labor helped exhaust her enough to sleep, even as nightmares of John's final moments often woke her in the darkness. A week after the sheriff's visit, Grace rode into town again for supplies and to check mail at the post office. As she tied her horse, she noticed a crowd gathered outside the jail. The hanging was scheduled for today. The outlaw Reeves would pay for his part in John's death. Grace hesitated, then turned toward the crowd. She had told Mrs. Henderson she wouldn't attend, but now felt drawn to witness some measure of justice for John. As she approached, the crowd parted respectfully, murmurs of sympathy following her. Sheriff Wilkins stood on the steps of the jailhouse beside a gaunt prisoner whose hands were bound before him. Lucas Tanner stood nearby, his expression grim as he surveyed the gathering. The sheriff raised his hands for quiet. Today, we see justice done for the murder of John Daugherty and the robbery of honest cattle money. Jeremiah Reeves has been found guilty and sentenced to hang. The prisoner's eyes darted across the crowd, landing on Grace. Unlike the stories she'd heard of remorseless killers, this man looked terrified. His gaze locked with hers, desperation evident. "Please," he called suddenly, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Daugherty, I didn't kill your husband. I was there, but I didn't fire a shot." The crowd muttered angrily as the sheriff grabbed Reeves's arm. "That's enough out of you. It was Blackwood. Tom Blackwood shot him. I can tell you where they're heading." The prisoner continued frantically. Lucas stepped forward, suddenly alert. Sheriff, might be worth hearing him out. The sheriff hesitated, looking between Grace, Lucas, and the condemned man. "This some kind of trick, Reeves. You've had weeks to name names." "Thought they'd come for me," Reeves replied, his face pale. "But they've left me to hang. Please, I can help you find them." Grace felt the eyes of the entire town upon her. This man had been part of the gang that took John's life, yet he claimed innocence of the actual killing. Did it matter which of them had pulled the trigger? They were all guilty in her eyes, yet something made her step forward. "Sheriff, if he knows where the others are, perhaps we should listen." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some voiced approval of Grace's mercy, while others demanded the hanging proceed as planned. "Mrs. Daugherty, you don't have to do this," the sheriff said quietly. "I want those men caught," she replied firmly. "All of them." The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right, take him back inside. We'll hear what he has to say." Inside the jail's small office, Grace sat stiffly as Reeves, still bound, was seated across from her. The sheriff and Lucas stood nearby, watching carefully. "Start talking," the sheriff ordered. Reeves nodded frantically. "There were 5 of us. Me, Blackwood, he's the leader, then Hendricks, Wallace, and Malone. We've been working our way north from Texas, hitting cattle drives." "How'd you know about Daugherty's drive?" Lucas asked. "Blackwood has a contact in town, someone who tips him off about when big money's moving." Reeves licked his dry lips. "Don't know who it is." "Blackwood always met them alone." Grace leaned forward. "And the railroad letter." "Did you take that from my husband?" Confusion crossed Reeves's face. "What letter?" "We took the money and some valuables. Blackwood got a fancy watch. That's all I saw." Lucas and the sheriff exchanged glances. "Where were they headed after the robbery?" Lucas pressed. "South." "Blackwood's got a hideout in Colorado Territory. Abandoned mining town called Solitude, up in the mountains west of Denver." Grace watched the man carefully. And why should we believe you? Reeves met her eyes. Madam, I've done wrong, been running with bad men. But I never killed nobody, and I swear on my mother's grave I didn't kill your husband. That was Blackwood. Cold-blooded shot when Mr. Daugherty wouldn't hand over his watch. Grace felt her composure slipping. The image of John refusing to surrender his father's watch, then being gunned down for such a small act of defiance, was almost more than she could bear. If your information leads to their capture, the sheriff said, I'll write to the judge about commuting your sentence to prison time. Hope flickered across Reeves's face. It's the truth, I swear it. After leaving the jail, Grace found herself unable to face the sympathetic looks from townspeople. She ducked into the alleyway beside the general store, pressing her back against the wall as she struggled to compose herself. Mrs. Daugherty. She looked up to find Lucas Tanner approaching, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right? No, she answered honestly, too emotionally drained for pretense. But I will be, he nodded, keeping a respectful distance. What you did in there listening to Reeves that took courage. It wasn't courage, Grace replied, just the need to know the truth. Truth can be the hardest thing to face sometimes. His voice held that same note of personal understanding she'd noticed before. Will you go after them? To this solitude place, Lucas nodded. Sheriff's organizing a posse. We leave tomorrow at first light. Grace straightened her shoulders. I want to come with you. Surprise registered on his face. Mrs. Daugherty, this isn't my husband was murdered by these men, she interrupted. I have more right than anyone to see justice done. It's dangerous country, Lucas countered, and these are desperate men. I can ride as well as any man, Mr. Tanner, and I can shoot. She lifted her chin. Besides, I need to recover John's watch. It's the last connection to his family. Lucas studied her for a long moment. The sheriff won't agree to this. Then don't tell him. I'll follow the posse if I must. A reluctant smile touched his lips. Somehow I believe you would, he sighed. Mrs. Daugherty, Grace, she interrupted. If we're to argue, you might as well use my given name. Grace, he amended. I can't allow you to put yourself in danger. You don't have the authority to allow or disallow anything, Mr. Tanner. Lucas, he corrected with the faintest hint of amusement. Lucas, she acknowledged. This is something I need to do, not just for justice, but for myself, to face these men and understand why John had to die over a pocket watch. He considered her words. Understanding why doesn't always bring the peace you're seeking. Perhaps not, but I'll never know unless I try. She held his gaze. You said you were heading to California for a new beginning. Before that happens, I need closure on what came before. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. The posse leaves at dawn. I'll be at your ranch an hour before to escort you. If you've changed your mind by then, no one will think less of you. I won't change my mind. As Grace rode home, her thoughts were in turmoil. The prospect of confronting John's killers terrified her, yet she felt more alive than she had since receiving that terrible telegram. The numbness that had enveloped her was giving way to something else, determination, perhaps. Or maybe just the need to do something other than passively accept her grief. Back at the ranch, she informed Clive that she would be leaving for several days on personal business. His concerned questions were met with vague responses that she knew didn't satisfy him, but she couldn't risk him trying to stop her. That night, as Grace packed provisions and checked John's rifle, doubts crept in. Was she being foolish? What did she truly hope to accomplish? Would confronting Blackwood bring her any peace? She remembered Lucas's words about truth being hard to face. He seemed to speak from experience, another piece of the puzzle that was Lucas Tanner. Despite her initial suspicions, she found herself trusting him, though she couldn't explain why. When dawn approached, Grace was already awake, dressed in her most practical riding clothes, a split skirt that allowed for comfortable riding astride, a sturdy blouse, and a leather vest of John's that she'd altered to fit her smaller frame. She'd braided her hair tightly and packed only essentials in her saddlebags. She was waiting on the porch when Lucas arrived, leading a pack horse alongside his own mount. "You're determined, then," he said as he dismounted. "I am." He studied her practical attire and nodded approvingly. "We'll need to ride hard to catch up with the posse. They left earlier than planned." As they rode toward the mountains, Lucas explained that the sheriff had deputized him and two other men brothers named Ellis and Emmett Cooper who had tracking experience. They planned to follow the outlaw's trail to Solitude, then determine the best approach based on what they found. "Reeves claims there's only one road in and out of the town," Lucas said as they rode. "Makes it defensible, but also makes it harder for them to escape if they're surrounded." "How dangerous will this be?" Grace asked directly. Lucas didn't sugarcoat his answer. "Very. These men are killers who won't hesitate to shoot, and they're likely watching the approach to their hideout. Then why did the sheriff agree to such a small posse? He didn't have much choice. Most men in town are preparing for winter, can't leave their ranches unattended." He glanced at her. "It's not too late to turn back." "Yes, it is," she replied simply. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the vast Wyoming landscape around them providing space for thought. Grace found herself studying Lucas as they traveled, the confident way he sat his horse, his constant awareness of their surroundings, the weathered lines of his face that spoke of years under the western sun. "You're not just a cowhand, are you?" she finally asked. His eyes met hers briefly before returning to scan the horizon. "What makes you say that? The way you move, the way you watch everything. You remind me of the cavalry officers who passed through during the war." A small smile touched his lips. "Observant of you." He was quiet for a moment. "I rode with the Union cavalry. After the war, I worked as a scout for the Army, then as a deputy marshal in Montana Territory. And now I'm just a man looking for something different." There was a finality in his tone that discouraged further questions. By midday, they caught sight of the posse ahead, 3 riders moving steadily toward the mountains that marked the Wyoming-Colorado border. "Mrs. Daugherty," Sheriff Wilkins exclaimed when they caught up, his expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" "She insisted on coming, Sheriff," Lucas explained before Grace could answer. "Thought it better to escort her myself than have her following alone." The Cooper brothers exchanged glances but remained silent, their weathered faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. "This is no place for a woman," the sheriff insisted, "especially one in mourning." "I appreciate your concern," Grace replied firmly, "but this is precisely where I need to be. Those men took my husband. I intend to see them face justice." The sheriff looked to Lucas, who merely shrugged. "She's determined, Sheriff, and she rides well enough to keep up." With obvious reluctance, Sheriff Wilkins agreed to allow Grace to continue, though he made it clear she was to remain behind when they confronted the outlaws. "First sign of trouble, you hide. That's not negotiable, Mrs. Daugherty." Grace nodded her agreement, knowing it was the only way she'd be permitted to continue. They made camp that evening in a sheltered valley, the distant mountains looming larger as they approached the territorial border. The Cooper brothers proved taciturn but efficient, setting up camp while Lucas scouted the area and the sheriff reviewed their plans. As they sat around the small fire, eating a simple meal of beans and biscuits, Ellis Cooper finally addressed Grace directly. "Begging your pardon, madam, but ain't many widows would chase after their husband's killers. Most would leave it to menfolk." "I'm not most widows, Mr. Cooper," Grace replied evenly. And I've found that waiting for others to handle matters isn't always satisfactory. Fair enough, he nodded, a hint of respect in his tone. That night, as the others slept, Grace found herself unable to rest. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the dying embers of their fire when Lucas silently joined her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I imagine John's final moments. Was he afraid? Did he suffer?" Lucas was silent for a long moment. "I've seen men die in battle and at the hands of outlaws," he finally said. "The good ones, men like your husband, seems to have been, they don't die thinking of themselves. They think of those they're leaving behind. Their last thoughts are of love, not fear." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I want to believe that. Believe it," he said simply. "It's the truth." "How can you be so certain?" Lucas stared into the dying fire. "Because I've been close enough to death myself to know what comes to mind when you think your time has ended." His voice held that same note of personal understanding she'd noticed before. "It's not fear or regret. It's the faces of those you love." Grace studied his profile in the faint glow of the embers. "You lost someone." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "My wife and daughter. 5 years ago. Fever took them both within days of each other." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Grace with unexpected force. "I'm sorry, truly." "As am I for your loss," he replied. "Grief changes us, makes us someone new whether we want that or not." "I don't know who I am anymore," Grace admitted. "Everything I planned, everything I dreamed, it was all with John. Now I'm just adrift." "It gets better," Lucas said softly. "Not easier exactly, but different. Eventually, you learn to carry it differently." They sat in companionable silence until the fire died completely. Before returning to her bedroll, Grace spoke again. "Thank you for understanding why I needed to come." "Sometimes," Lucas replied. "The only way past the pain is through it." The next day brought them to the Colorado border, where the landscape grew increasingly mountainous. The Cooper brothers, skilled trackers both, found signs that a group of riders had passed this way recently. 4 men, Emmett Cooper reported, crouching to examine tracks in a creek bed, heading straight for the mining country. "That matches what Reeves told us," the sheriff commented. "Means we're on the right trail." As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder and patches of early snow appeared in shaded areas. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file along precarious paths with steep drops to one side. "Solitude should be just beyond that ridge," Lucas pointed as they paused to rest the horses. "According to the map, there's only one approach, a narrow canyon that leads into the valley where the town was built." "Perfect place for an ambush," Sheriff Wilkins noted grimly. "Which is why we won't all ride in together," Lucas replied. "I suggest we leave the horses here and approach on foot from different directions." The sheriff considered this. "The Cooper boys and I can circle around, come in from the north. Tanner, you approach from this side. Mrs. Daugherty will remain here with the horses," Lucas finished firmly. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Lucas cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. "This is where I draw the line, Grace. You've come this far, but I won't have your death on my conscience." Something in his tone, the personal concern rather than mere professional duty, silenced her objections. "Very well, but promise me you'll be careful." "Always am," he replied with a faint smile. As the men prepared to set out on foot, checking weapons and dividing ammunition, Lucas took Grace aside. "If we're not back by nightfall, take my horse and ride back the way we came. Don't stop until you reach the first settlement. You expect trouble." "I expect men who have killed before to fight rather than hang." He hesitated, then removed a small revolver from his boot and handed it to her. "Keep this close, just in case." Grace accepted the weapon, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her hand. "Thank you. When this is over," Lucas said quietly, "what then? Will you still go to California?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know, perhaps." She studied his face. "And you?" "That depends," he replied enigmatically before rejoining the others. Grace watched as the four men disappeared into the rugged terrain. The sheriff and Cooper brothers heading north while Lucas moved west, using the scattered pine trees for cover. The mountain silence closed in around her as she waited, the occasional whinny from the horses the only sound breaking the stillness. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Grace secured the horses, checked their gear repeatedly, and paced the small clearing until her legs ached. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, her anxiety grew. What was happening in Solitude? Had they found Blackwood and his gang? Were they even now engaged in a deadly confrontation? The crack of a distant gunshot shattered the silence. Grace froze, listening intently. Another shot followed, then several in quick succession. A firefight had erupted in the ghost town beyond the ridge. Her heart raced as more shots echoed across the mountains, which were fired by Lucas and the others, which by the outlaws. The not knowing was unbearable. Against all promises and better judgment, Grace found herself moving toward the sound, the small revolver clutched in her hand. She knew she was breaking her word, but the thought of waiting helplessly while men died, possibly Lucas among them, was suddenly intolerable. She climbed the ridge carefully, using trees and rocks for cover as she'd seen Lucas do. The gunfire had become sporadic now, single shots rather than volleys. As she crested the ridge, she caught her first glimpse of Solitude. The abandoned mining town lay in a small valley below a cluster of weathered buildings, surrounded by silent mine entrances dug into the mountainsides. From her vantage point, she could see movement near the largest structure, likely once the town's saloon or hotel. Two bodies lay motionless in the street, Grace's breath caught. Who had fallen? Friend or foe? She couldn't distinguish figures at this distance. A flash of movement caught her eye, someone running between buildings on the far side of town. More gunshots followed, and Grace instinctively ducked lower behind the boulder sheltering her. The impulse to rush down was strong, but she forced herself to remain hidden. She would be no help to anyone if she became another target. Instead, she watched, straining to make sense of the movements below. Gradually, the gunfire ceased entirely. In the tense silence that followed, Grace saw figures emerging from various positions around the town center. With profound relief, she recognized Sheriff Wilkins and the Cooper brothers converging on the main building. But where was Lucas? Her question was answered moments later when he appeared from behind a smaller structure, rifle in hand. Four men, Lucas, the sheriff, and the Cooper brothers, all apparently unharmed. Relief flooded through Grace, followed immediately by shame at her disobedience. She began to retreat, intending to return to the horses before they discovered she'd left her post, when a movement at the edge of her vision stopped her cold. A fifth man, one she didn't recognize, was creeping along the roofline of the building behind Lucas, a rifle raised to his shoulder. Without conscious thought, Grace raised the revolver. The distance was considerable for such a small weapon, but she had no choice. Lucas was seconds from being shot in the back. She steadied her arm against the boulder, aimed as John had once taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of her shot echoed across the valley. Below, all heads turned toward the ridge where she was hidden. The man on the rooftop staggered, his own shot going wild as he lost his balance and tumbled from his perch. Grace remained frozen, the revolver still extended, as Lucas and the others rushed to the fallen man. She watched as they surrounded him, weapons trained downward. Even from this distance, she could see the moment when they looked up toward her position, realization dawning. Knowing her presence was discovered, Grace stood slowly and began making her way down toward the town. Her hands trembled not from the cold, but from the knowledge that she had just shot a man. Whether he lived or died, she had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. As she approached the outskirts of the ghost town, Lucas strode to meet her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, relief, and something else she couldn't quite define. "You promised to stay with the horses," he said when they were within speaking distance, his voice taut with suppressed emotion. "I heard gunfire," she replied simply. "I couldn't just wait not knowing. You could have been killed. As could you if I hadn't been here." She gestured toward the man now being restrained by the sheriff and Ellis Cooper. "Is that him, Blackwood?" Lucas nodded grimly. "Tom Blackwood himself. You winged him, shot him in the shoulder. He'll live to hang. And the others, 2 dead, 1 wounded and captured." He jerked his head toward the bodies in the street. "None of ours, thanks to your timely intervention." Grace swayed slightly, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb. Lucas caught her elbow, steadying her. "First time shooting a man?" he asked more gently. She nodded, unable to find words. "It gets easier," he said, then grimaced. "That's not a comfort, I suppose. Did you find John's watch?" she asked, needing to focus on something concrete. "We did." Lucas reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver timepiece. Blackwood was carrying it. Grace took the watch with trembling fingers, its familiar weight and the cool metal against her palm bringing fresh tears to her eyes. She opened the case, revealing the Latin inscription inside. "Tempus veritas revelat," she read aloud. "Time reveals truth." "Fitting," Lucas commented softly. As the sheriff and Cooper brothers secured the prisoners for transport back to Wyoming, Grace found herself sitting on the steps of the abandoned hotel, John's watch clutched in her hands, trying to process the day's events. Lucas joined her after conferring with the others. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Start back at first light." Grace nodded absently, still staring at the watch. "I thought this would feel different," she admitted. "Catching them, having the watch back, I thought there would be, I don't know, relief, satisfaction." "Justice doesn't heal grief," Lucas said quietly. "It just prevents the wound from festering." She looked up at him. "Is that what you found when you lost your family?" A shadow crossed his face. "I never found the fever that took them. There was no one to blame, no justice to seek." He sat beside her on the step. "That's its own kind of hell. So what did you do? How did you go on?" Lucas was silent for a long moment. "I ran. Took jobs that kept me moving, kept me from thinking. Worked as a deputy marshal hunting men worse than myself." His eyes met hers. "It wasn't living. Just existing. And now, what changed?" "I got tired," he admitted with a faint smile. "Tired of running from memories instead of making new ones." They sat in companionable silence as twilight descended on the ghost town, transforming the abandoned buildings into looming shadows. In the distance, an owl called a lonely sound that echoed through the empty streets. "I want to forget," Grace whispered finally, giving voice to the thought that had driven her since John's death. "All of it. The pain, the emptiness, the memories that hurt to recall." Lucas turned to her, his expression gentle in the fading light. "Then I'll help you remember softly," he said. "Because forgetting isn't the answer. It's remembering differently with gratitude instead of pain." Something in his words touched a place in Grace that had been closed since John's death. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to. These felt different, cleansing somehow. "How?" she asked simply. "One day at a time," he replied. "By honoring what was while still allowing what might be." As night fell fully over solitude, Grace found herself sharing stories of John with Lucas, not the painful final memories, but the good ones. Their courtship in Boston, where she'd scandalized her family by falling for a westbound rancher. Their first difficult winter in Wyoming. The small daily kindnesses that had defined their marriage in turn. Lucas spoke of his wife, Margaret, and their daughter, Emma, tentatively at first, then with growing ease as he recounted their life in Montana. For both, it was the first time they'd spoken so openly of their lost loved ones, and there was a strange comfort in the shared unburdening. "They become part of us," Lucas said as they sat beside the small fire the men had built in the center of town. "Not wounds to be forgotten, but experiences that shaped who we are." Grace contemplated his words, turning John's watch in her hands. "I've been so afraid of the memories," she admitted, as if remembering would somehow make the loss more real. "It's the opposite," Lucas replied. "Remembering keeps them with us, just differently than before." As the others settled for the night, Grace and Lucas continued talking about their pasts, but also about the futures they'd been considering. His plans for California had been vague, perhaps a small ranch near the coast, away from the harsh mountain winters. Her own dreams of a new start, there had been equally undefined, just somewhere without painful reminders. "Perhaps," Lucas ventured carefully as the fire burned low, "you needn't go so far to find a new beginning." Grace glanced at him, catching his meaning. "Are you suggesting Wyoming still has something to offer me?" "I'm suggesting," he replied, meeting her gaze, "that beginnings can happen anywhere, with the right circumstances." The journey back to Silver Creek took 3 days, with the prisoners slowing their progress. During that time, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Lucas's quiet strength and gentle understanding. Unlike others who treated her grief as something to be hastily moved past, he acknowledged its depth while still encouraging her to look forward. By the time they reached town, something had shifted between them, an unspoken connection that went beyond their shared experiences of loss. It was tentative and fragile, but undeniably present. The town welcomed the posse as heroes, the news of Blackwood's capture spreading rapidly. Grace found herself the object of renewed sympathy, but also a certain admiration for her part in the confrontation, though the sheriff had tactfully downplayed her disobedience in favor of emphasizing her crucial intervention. As life returned to its normal rhythms, Grace faced the question of what came next. With winter approaching, selling the ranch remained impractical until spring. But the prospect of months alone with her memories in the home she'd shared with John seemed less daunting after her conversations with Lucas. 2 weeks after their return, Lucas appeared at her ranch, leading his horse up the lane as she worked in the small kitchen garden she'd established that summer. "Mr. Tanner," she greeted him, brushing soil from her hands. "This is unexpected." "I hope not unwelcome," he replied, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Thought I'd check how you're faring." "Better," she admitted. "Taking things one day at a time, as you suggested." He nodded approvingly. "I've been offered a position," he said after a moment. "Sheriff Wilkins asked if I'd consider staying on as deputy. Seems our adventure impressed him." Grace felt a surprising flutter of pleasure at the news. "Will you accept?" "I'm considering it." His blue eyes held hers. "Depends on certain factors." Such as whether I'd be welcome to call occasionally. On you." His directness was tempered by the careful way he watched her reaction. Grace felt warmth rising to her cheeks. "I believe you would," she replied softly. "Be welcome, that is." A smile touched his lips, the most unguarded she'd seen from him. "In that case, I may postpone California indefinitely." As autumn deepened toward winter, Lucas became a regular visitor at the Daugherty ranch. Their friendship evolved gradually, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of each other's past sorrows. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits, to their conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions about life's unexpected turns. With Lucas's encouragement, Grace began taking a more active role in managing the ranch, working closely with Clive to learn aspects of the operation John had always handled. Though she still intended to sell in spring, she felt a growing pride in maintaining what John had built not just as his widow, but as someone capable in her own right. The townsfolk of Silver Creek noticed the developing relationship between the widow and the new deputy, of course. Some approved, seeing it as a natural healing for Grace. Others whispered that it was too soon, that proper mourning should last longer. Grace found that she cared less about such opinions as time passed. One crisp December evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink, Lucas finally spoke of what had been growing between them. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "When I rode into Silver Creek, I was just passing through. Another stop on a journey with no real destination." Grace turned to him, waiting for him to continue. "Meeting you changed that." His gaze remained on the horizon. "Even in your grief, perhaps, because of how you faced it, you reminded me that life continues. That it's possible to honor the past while still embracing what comes after." "You did the same for me," Grace replied softly. "When you said you'd help me remember softly, that was when I first felt hope again." Lucas reached across the space between their chairs, his hand finding hers. "I care for you, Grace, more than I thought possible after Margaret. Different but no less real." Grace twined her fingers with his, the simple contact sending warmth through her despite the evening chill. "I care for you too," she admitted, "and that frightens me sometimes. As if caring for you somehow diminishes what I felt for John." "It doesn't," Lucas assured her. "The heart isn't so limited. It expands to hold what it needs to." As winter settled over Wyoming, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine white expanse, Grace and Lucas's relationship deepened. He spent Christmas at the ranch, bringing modest gifts for her and small tokens for the ranch hands. For Grace, he'd found a delicate silver chain for John's watch, so she could wear it close to her heart while keeping her hands free for work. "It's perfect," she told him as he fastened it around her neck. "A way to keep him with me without being trapped in the past." The new year brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Lucas rode out whenever the weather permitted, sometimes staying for days when fresh snowfall made return to town impossible. These extended visits allowed them to know each other more fully, not just as two people who had suffered similar losses, but as individuals with their own strengths, flaws, and dreams. Grace discovered Lucas's unexpected talent for storytelling, honed during long winter evenings in mountain camps. He learned of her passion for books and education, which had once scandalized her Boston family when she insisted on attending lectures at Harvard alongside her brothers. By February, when Lucas was trapped at the ranch for nearly a week by a particularly fierce blizzard, their relationship had evolved into something neither could deny. They still maintained propriety. Lucas slept in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, but the connection between them was evident to anyone who saw them together. On the final evening before the trail to town would be passable again, they sat before the fire in her small parlor, the snow-muffled silence of the winter night around them. "I've been thinking," Lucas said, watching the flames. "About spring. About your plans to sell the ranch." Grace nodded. It was a subject they'd carefully avoided in recent weeks. "I still believe it's the practical choice. This place is too large for me to manage alone indefinitely." What if you weren't alone? His voice was quiet but steady. Grace's breath caught. What are you suggesting, Lucas? He turned to face her fully. I'm suggesting that I care for you more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone again. That the thought of you leaving in spring has become increasingly difficult to bear. He took her hand gently. I'm suggesting that perhaps there's a future for us, together. Here or elsewhere, that part matters less than the together. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a complicated joy. Are you asking me to marry you? I am, he confirmed, his blue eyes serious. Not to replace what you lost, but to build something new alongside it. If you think that's possible. Grace was silent for a long moment, her thoughts turning to John. What would he have wanted for her? Lonely fidelity to his memory, or happiness, even if found in an unexpected place? John once told me, she said slowly, that love isn't about possession. It's about wanting the best for someone, even when you can't be the one to provide it. She squeezed Lucas's hand. I think he would approve of you, of us. Hope brightened Lucas's eyes. Is that a yes? It's a yes, Grace confirmed, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Yes, I will marry you, Lucas Tanner. His smile was like sunrise after the longest night as he drew her gently into his arms. Their first kiss was tentative, a bridge between past sorrows and future joys. When they parted, Grace felt a peace she hadn't known since before John's death, not forgetting, but remembering softly, just as Lucas had promised. They were married in April, as the last snows melted and the first wildflowers appeared across the prairie. The small church in Silver Creek was filled with ranchers and townspeople who had watched their relationship unfold with varying degrees of approval. By the wedding day, even the most traditional among them had come to see the rightness of the match. Grace wore a simple blue dress rather than traditional white, acknowledging her status as a widow while still embracing her new beginning. Around her neck hung John's watch, a symbol of honoring the past while moving forward. Sheriff Wilkins stood as Lucas's best man, and Mrs. Henderson, who had become Grace's unexpected friend during the winter months, served as her matron of honor. Do you, Lucas James Tanner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The minister asked. I do, Lucas replied, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Grace Elizabeth Daugherty, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Grace met Lucas's gaze, seeing in his blue eyes all the understanding, strength, and love that had gradually healed her broken heart. I do, she answered clearly. As they exchanged rings, simple bands that symbolized their commitment, Grace felt John's presence not as a shadow over her happiness, but as a silent blessing. She would always carry him with her, just as Lucas would always carry Margaret and Emma. Their pasts were not burdens to be forgotten, but foundations upon which to build new memories. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers outside the church, Mr. Patterson approached with uncharacteristic humility. Mrs. Tanner, that is, Mrs. Daugherty, I mean. Grace is fine, Mr. Patterson, she said with a smile. Grace, then. I wanted to offer my congratulations and also some news about the railroad matter. He glanced at Lucas. The survey has been completed and they're quite interested in the northern section of your property. The offer they're prepared to make is substantial. Lucas squeezed her hand. That's Grace's decision. The ranch remains hers. Grace considered for a moment. We'll discuss it with you next week, Mr. Patterson. Today is for celebrating, not business. The banker nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed from the awkward conversation. As spring blossomed into summer, Grace and Lucas settled into their shared life at the ranch that was now truly theirs together. With the railroad's offer providing financial security, they decided to keep the ranch rather than sell, reducing its size by selling the northern pasture. but maintaining enough land for a viable operation. Lucas took to ranching with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, working alongside Clive and the other hands while still maintaining his deputy position in town. Grace continued managing the household and books, her confidence growing with each successful decision. Their evenings were spent on the porch swing Lucas had built as a wedding gift, watching the sun set over the land they both loved. It was during one such sunset in late summer that Grace shared news of her own. "I saw Dr. Martin today," she said, her hand resting lightly on her still flat stomach. "He confirms what I suspected. We're going to have a child, Lucas, next spring." The wonder that transformed his face was something Grace knew she would remember forever. "A child," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "A new life. A new memory we'll make together." As Lucas held her close, his hand covering hers over their growing child, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief to the heights of unexpected joy, from wanting to forget to learning to remember softly. From two broken people to a family being reborn. Winter returned to Wyoming, but this time Grace welcomed it. The cozy evenings by the fire with Lucas as they planned for their child's arrival. The ranch hands built a cradle as a gift, carved from local pine with intricate designs that showed surprising artistry from men more accustomed to roping cattle than crafting furniture. In town, news of the coming baby was received with genuine delight. Mrs. Henderson organized the women to sew layettes and blankets. Sheriff Wilkins presented them with a rocking horse he'd commissioned from a craftsman in Cheyenne. "Every deputy's child needs a proper mount," he declared gruffly when Lucas tried to thank him. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, she found herself often touching John's watch, which she still wore daily. It no longer brought pain, but a gentle remembrance and gratitude for the love she'd known with him. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she imagined John and Margaret somehow aware of the happiness their beloved spouses had found together, not a replacement for what was lost, but a new chapter neither had expected. Their son was born as spring returned to the prairie, a robust boy with Lucas's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair that might have come from either parent. They named him William John Tanner, honoring both Lucas's father and Grace's first husband. As Grace held their child for the first time, Lucas beside her with wonder and love evident in his expression. She felt a completion to the circle that had begun with that blood-soaked telegram nearly 2 years before. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she whispered as Lucas gently traced their son's tiny features with a calloused finger. "Nor I," he agreed. "But that's the miracle, isn't it? Life continues. Love endures even when its form changes." William grew into a sturdy toddler, filling the ranch house with laughter that had been absent for too long. His first steps were taken across the porch where Grace and Lucas had shared so many evening conversations. His first words, "Mama" and "Papa," echoed through rooms once silent with grief. When William was 2, a daughter joined their family, Emma Grace Tanner, named for Lucas's first daughter and her mother. With her arrival, their family felt complete, though both agreed they remained open to whatever blessings life might bring. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Lucas presented Grace with a gift, a family portrait he'd commissioned from an artist passing through Silver Creek. The painting showed them on the porch of their ranch house, Lucas standing tall and proud, Grace seated with Emma on her lap, and William leaning against his father's leg. But what brought tears to Grace's eyes was the artist's subtle inclusion of 2 faint figures in the background, almost like reflections in a window glass. One was clearly a man resembling the photographs of John that Grace had shared. The other, a woman holding a small child, bore the features Lucas had described of Margaret and Emma. "To remember softly," Lucas said quietly as Grace studied the painting. "All of what made us who we are today." As the years passed, Silver Creek grew from a small settlement into a proper town, aided by the railroad's arrival. The Tanner Ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. William and Emma grew strong and confident, raised with stories of courage, perseverance, and the different kinds of love that had shaped their family. On quiet evenings, Grace would sometimes take out John's watch, now showing signs of age despite careful maintenance. She would wind it and listen to its steady ticking, a reminder of how time continued its relentless march, bringing both sorrow and joy in its passage. "Tempus veritas revelat," she would murmur. "Time reveals truth." And the truth it had revealed was this: that hearts, like the vast Wyoming landscape, had room enough for both memory and hope. That grief, while transformative, need not be defining. That love in all its forms was the thread that connected past to present to future. As she closed the watch case and leaned against Lucas's steady shoulder, Grace reflected that she had indeed learned to remember softly, not forgetting what was, but embracing what could be, allowing both to exist together in the fullness of a life well lived.